realized it starts with a couple of minutes of delay due to the bus service we had. And the conference, which is conducted in the context of the international conference Fluid Cultures, Fluid Natures, Fluid Cultures, Malta and the Mediterranean. This conference, which would not have been possible without the support of several Maltese partners, some of whom are present tonight, and whom I would like to express our thanks particularly. This conference is one of the major projects of the newly founded Arab-German Young Academy of Sciences and Humanities, which is a bilateral and transdisciplinary academy of sciences that initiates innovative interdisciplinary research projects and promotes active engagement of early career researchers from Germany and various Arabic countries in academia and society. Having realized that the Mediterranean has lost its historical function of bringing civilizations in contact, and its position as a region with strong economic relations, we, the organizers of this conference, want to counterbalance this fact by bringing scholars from both sides of the Mediterranean and from various academic disciplines together in Malta in order to share our thoughts, our ideas, and a part of our personal life. Malta is the perfect spot for this endeavor. It is the land between the lands, i.e. it encompasses the true meaning of the Latin word Mediterraneum. We hope that by this conference, the final assessment of the renowned historian David Abulafia, who wrote, as he called it, quote, a biography of the Mediterranean, can be counterbalanced. He wrote, quote, seas connect and separate. Sometimes they do the former more, sometimes the latter. The Mediterranean used to connect 3 continents most of the time. But it is today a border that separates these continents. Unquote. Who could help us better in achieving these aims than a specialist on Maltese language and culture, who is neither from Germany, nor from an Arab country, nor from Malta? I am referring, of course, to tonight's speaker, Professor Michael Cooperson, whom I would like to introduce briefly to you. Michael Cooperson got his BA, MA, and PhD degree from Harvard University in the United States. He was assistant professor at the University of California, Los Angeles from 1995 to 2001, and was then successfully promoted to associate professor at the same university, and finally in 2004 to full professor of Arabic at the same university. For 1 year, he served as visiting professor at Stanford University, and Michael Cooperson is in particular renowned in our field for his knowledge and expertise on pre-modern and modern Arabic literature. In particular, poetry, Quran, oratory, historiography, and biographical writing. However, he is also a specialist on Maltese culture and language, as I just said. Some of his publications, which should be mentioned here briefly, are the title Classical Arabic Biography, The Heirs of the Prophet in the Age of Al-Ma'mun. This one was translated into Arabic in 2005. And now I have to get my last sheet. He wrote a biography of the Caliph Al-Ma'mun in 2005 and edited 2 volumes, co-edited 2 volumes on autobiography in Arabic literature and a dictionary on Arabic literary culture. From the several articles he published, I just want to mention one, and now all Maltese, please forgive me my bad Maltese, because the paper was written in Maltese and had the title Kharsa Jdida Lein Irakont Tal-Khimyari Dvar Malta. What it is about, I couldn't make out, but I'm sure he can tell us. And apart from these studies in Arabic literature, Michael Cooperson focuses on media representation of Islamic figures. For example, he studied Al-Ma'mun and Ali Arida's representation in Iranian TV. And also his lecture tonight will tackle this field. The structure of tonight's lecture will be that Michael Cooperson will speak around 45 minutes, and then we will have approximately 20 minutes for questions or comments, and then move on to the more social part of the evening. With these comments, I would ask you to come forward, and looking forward to your lecture. Thanks for coming to Malta and accepting the invitation.
Thank you very much. It's very kind. I'm especially grateful you mentioned that I'm not Arab or German or Maltese. You did not mention I'm not young either. I feel I don't want to lay claim to being an expert on Malta. Already today I've learned things about the island that I didn't know before. This is my 6th time here, but I've never been to the reverse osmosis plant. So I'm learning a great deal from all of you and from this experience. So I'd like to thank the organizers, and thank all of you and my friend Kirill Dmitriev, who apparently had some role in nominating me for this honor. The actual talk is more specific than the title might suggest. I'm going to be talking about history understood here as religion, nationhood, and language, as represented in one recent television series, which is probably the most popular television series in Maltese history. The series is called Deceduti, which means the deceased. I think it's a work of genius. When I tell Maltese friends about it, they say, "Why are professors like you studying that kind of thing?" Well, I hope by the end of the talk you'll see why I think it's a work of genius and why I study it. I'd like to begin with a statement by Victoria Nelson. This is what she has to say about the divine. When the divine has been exiled from the table of serious art and intellectual discussion for well over a century, you have to look for it in what elite culture thinks of as the trash. That is, in the sub-zeitgeist, that disreputable realm of popular culture, B-movies, pulp fiction, and folk belief, where modernity or no, the line between belief and imagination is often erased. A shadowy territory where a certain kind of low-level but potent theological rumination is constantly taking place. So what we're going to do then is to look for the divine. But first, we need a bit of background. And you'll find on the handout a selected list of important dates in Maltese history, which you should feel free to consult because we're going to go very quickly. If you are Maltese, or if you know about Maltese history, you will understand that I'm going to be covering extremely complex subjects very selectively, which means simplifying them in a way that may seem unfair. But if you do feel that way, please do mention it in the question period. The dates on the handout are intended to illustrate 3 points, 3 elements of Maltese self-understanding. First, as a Christian nation. Second, as a European country. And finally, as a nation that speaks Maltese. According to the traditional account, Christianity came to Malta in 60 AD when the Apostle Paul was shipwrecked on the island. And many Maltese believe that the country has been Christian ever since. Now, as it happens, that's probably not true, for reasons which can cause a great deal of ill feeling and controversy even now. That's what the article was about, actually. Because the evidence for what happened to Malta after the first Christian settlement, or after the conversion, is contained in Arabic sources. And that's why Arabists have something to say about it. But for our purposes, it doesn't matter. What matters for us is that, according to tradition, Christianity persisted under Muslim rule, which continued until 1091. And as we all know, and as we're going to hear more about, I think, later in the program, it was in 1565 that the local population, under the Knights of St. John, helped defend the island against a naval assault by the Ottomans. And it was, and in popular memory, this so-called First Great Siege, it was then that Malta not only affirmed its essentially Christian character, but also defended itself, and by extension all of Christendom, against the terrors of Islam. One of the neglected monuments of this battle is the so-called Turkish cemetery, which is a wonderful building. Well, it was commissioned by the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan in the 19th century, to commemorate the Turkish troops who had fallen in the siege. The cemetery is this kind of Orientalist fantasy designed by an Italian architect. And what have the Maltese done with it? Well, they've hidden it behind some warehouses and auto body shops as a kind of erasure of this part of their history. You pass them away from the airport. If you just look for the Skemby battery sign as you're coming on, well, if you're going back to the airport, look right. Right before you get the Halu, and if you're lucky, you'll get a glimpse of the sort of fantasy minarets there at the end of the street. And you can't get in. I had to break in, actually. There is a Jewish cemetery right next to it that I couldn't break in. There are actually 3 Jewish cemeteries in Malta, but don't let me get distracted. Okay, so moving very quickly forward, I think it's fair to say that the authority of the Catholic Church remained largely unshaken until the mid-20th century, when Dom Mintoff, who was then the leader of the Labour Party, gets involved in a massive conflict with the church. I'd like to show you a brief clip of him making a speech. And what Maltese people will often say about him, opinion is of course very divided over whether he was a good or a bad thing. But I want to show you a brief example of him speaking against the church. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to leave this slideshow and enter into the video, and then put some subtitles on. So it may take a second, bear with me, and feel free to consult your handout there. If, by the way, you're curious about Maltese, you'll find that I've given you a bit of linguistic information in there as well, so please feel free to read that while I fuss and fret up here.
طويلة ما تنفش روحي نار نمضوا ديك الأوبوزيسيون والله يودوا له الجبل يدقوا له النبل.
So this is from a documentary about Mintoff, and what we're being told here is that when Mintoff would speak against the church, the priests would ring the church bells to try and drown him out. So you're going to see some very grainy video of him. I don't think you're going to hear any of the church bells, but you'll see him speaking against the church.
ما علوش يتكلم ويبقى هاني.
Now one could argue that it's with Mintoff that a process of secularization begins to take place. One milestone, arguably, there was in 1973, homosexuality was decriminalized. But some of the most significant pieces of what we might call broadly anti-clerical legislation are quite recent. Divorce was legalized in 2011, and the Civil Unions Bill was legalized just last year, was passed just last year, permitting marriage equality. Now this brings us to the second point of background I want to address, which is Malta's self-understanding as a European country. So Malta entered the 19th century as a possession of the British Empire. This is a statue of Queen Victoria in front of the National Library, usually covered with pigeon droppings. Now, even under British rule, the Maltese clergy and the local aristocracy continued to identify with Rome. And eventually two camps developed, one pro-Britain and the other pro-Italy. What turned the tide in favor of Britain was, of course, the Second World War. This, by the way, is what you saw when we were walking into Valletta earlier today when you look over the harbor. This is one of the peninsulas that you see coming out. And if you're a linguist, by the way, this is the one street in Malta where people still pronounce the Prof. That's Senglea, or Lisla. So this, in the popular imagination, was the Second Great Siege. After the war, there was talk of union with Britain, but those talks failed, and in 1964, Malta became an independent constitutional monarchy, and in 1974, a republic. As I'm sure many of you know, on the flag is the George Cross given to the island for valor during the war, and there's a debate even now in Malta. Some people say, we earned it, it's an award for bravery, we should keep it. Other people say, it's a medal from another country, what is it still doing on our flag? In 2004, Malta joined the European Union. This is a boosterish kind of text telling us that it has one of the strongest economies in the European Union. And people always remark on the fact, they say, why is it written in Roman characters? Well, we'll get to that, but it is, as you know. So it's in this context that we should try to understand the recent legalization of divorce and civil unions. So Malta is, in a sense, at least some people here, want to align themselves with what they see as being the kind of progressive politics of other European countries. Not, of course, without significant controversy. So this brings us then to the final point of background, which is Malta understanding itself as a nation that speaks Maltese. The name Maltese is fairly recent. If you look at the beginnings of linguistic self-awareness, the language was called Punic, that is Phoenician. If you're Lebanese, you know all about this. As Christians, the Maltese wanted their language to be ancient and biblical, but not Arabic. And so, and Ahmed Faris al-Shadia, the Lebanese writer who was here in the 19th century, immediately saw how silly this was, and has some very mocking things to say about it in his book about Malta. Well, the fact is that it isn't Punic. It is Arabic, descended from the Arabic spoken by the Muslims who settled here in 1048 or 1049. This is the tombstone of Maimuna, which is in the Archaeological Museum in Gozo, and if anyone is staying longer here, you really should go over and check it out. It's beautiful, it's big. What it tells us, she died in 1174, so even after Christian rule was established, people were using Arabic as a monumental language. Now, of course, there's always got to be somebody to spoil the fun. There's an Italian scholar who thinks it was actually brought over from Tunis. In which case, I'd be sad. But just so you know, the full disclosure, it may not really be what it seems to be, but it's still beautiful and you should go see it. So how did Arabic become Maltese? Well, the short answer is that during the 13th century, the Christian rulers of the island forced the Muslim population to convert or leave. And those who converted continued to speak Arabic. But now they were cut off from the rest of the Arabic-speaking world. And they had no tradition of literacy because they were peasants, right? And they didn't have familiarity with classical Arabic to act as a brake on language change. So every word that has entered the language since the 13th century comes from somewhere else, whether it be Sicilian or Florentine Italian or Greek or Catalan or English or Spanish. All of those languages and many others are represented in the lexicon. And I'm just talking about the lexicon. If you get me started on syntax, we'll be here much longer. But syntax has also changed. So the result is really quite distinctive. Here's a quick example just to illustrate. I'm sure you've seen many of these already. This sign, unfortunately, is no longer there. But so Nisa, women in Arabic, of course. Socialisti is from Italian. So the core vocabulary, basic items are Arabic. Abstractions tend to be from Italian or Sicilian. Bormla is the name of the place where this sign, this club used to be, and there are all sorts of fanciful etymologies for it, like Abu Ramla and so on, none of which are remotely believable. And then, of course, you see the English Malta Labour Party, or Malta Labour Party, as they say. So it's that sort of summarizes, the sign that's no longer there, unfortunately, summarizes the diversity and complexity of the linguistic situation. The process of how it became a national language is interesting. Very briefly, it was the rivalry between English and Italian that made it possible for Maltese to emerge as a national language. There were arguments made in the 19th century for using the language in education. What Schnitz's arguing here is that children can't learn English or Italian without learning to read and write their own gibberish first, essentially. So he said, let them learn Maltese, which they should write, I think, in Arabic script. I think he wanted that, and then from there they can learn a proper language like English or Italian. So there were attempts, but eventually, of course, because of World War II, Italian was knocked out of the running, English emerges, and it's now a co-official language, but it is not a national language. I hope I haven't repeated a lot of things that you already know. I will pause, though, to ask if there's anything unclear about anything I've said so far, or any question or vociferous complaint about my criminal misrepresentation of Maltese.
I have a question.
Yes?
You said something about Maltese economy before when you said that they portrayed it as very strong. Isn't that true? Isn't that the growth rates that they actually currently have the second highest in the European Union? Isn't it like, it's not such a joke these days?
Oh, no, not at all. No.
Okay.
I guess I laugh because one of the common themes in the press is that if the Labour Party says the sky is blue, then the Nationalist Party denies it, and vice versa. So I think that was a Labour website that says, look how well we're doing now that we've won the last election. And so from the Nationalist Party perspective, it can't possibly be right. So there's that kind of factionalism about things. But yes, as far as I know, I'm not an economist, but as far as I know, the Maltese economy is doing very well. All right. So, to learn more about how mass culture deals with some of these issues, nationhood, religion, and language, I want to look at a popular comedy series called Deceduti, which means deceased. This is obviously an Italian-derived word. Although Maltese is unique in having a C with a dot on top, which is the shape. So it's not like Italian in that you can pronounce the C based on where it is. It actually, it's a shape. All right, the series ran on Malta's national television station from 2010 to 2012 on TVM. And it's about, starts with a man called Percival, who is from an aristocratic family, but he runs out of money. So he burns down his family's palazzo, collects the insurance money, and builds a block of apartments on the site. But what he doesn't know is that the palazzo was haunted. Haunted by ghosts going back all the way to the 16th century. And so when he builds the apartments, the flats, he traps, he doesn't know he's done this, but he's trapped the ghosts in the apartments. And so the people who come and rent apartments from him end up with, each one ends up with a ghost, or sometimes more than one ghost. And so the show ran for these 2 seasons, and it's about the interaction between the living and the dead. This is one of his ancestors, Doña Amelia. She is a Spanish noblewoman, married to one of the Knights of Malta, and she committed suicide in 1565. And she's one of the ghosts. Another is Manuel, who was a handyman at the palazzo. That looks like me, doesn't it? He actually works, Maltese actors don't make enough money to do it full time, and so you just see them out doing their jobs. He works at the airport. If you end up with baggage problems, you see him walking around. And another is Ciccio, who is an Italian pilot. He died when his plane crashed into the palazzo, killing Manuel. So the 2 of them died together in 1949. And finally, there are other ghosts, but we're not going to worry about them yet. This is the writer and director, a man called Carlos de Batista, who is called Mr. M, and he is a messenger between the ghosts and whoever runs this whole afterlife. And we discover that she's called the boss, and she's a she. We discover that in the 2nd season, so I kind of ruined it for you. But. So that's Mr. M, played by Carlos, who is the writer and director. Actually, all the actor credits and so on are in the handout. Okay, so given its subject matter, we might call this show uncanny. But for my purposes, I think a better term is Gothic, referring to a genre that deals in supernatural horror. And why I'm interested in that is, again, through an insight of Victoria Nelson. She defines the Gothic as the preferred mode, or even the only allowed one, that a predominantly secular scientific culture such as ours has for imagining and encountering the sacred. So we were looking for the divine, and what she argues is that in societies where theology is no longer a popular or heavily practiced pastime, we learn to think about the moral order of the universe through popular culture. So that makes Deceduti, I think, the perfect place to look for this, what she calls low-level but potent theological rumination. And as I hope I was able to show in giving you the background, it's really very difficult to talk about nation and language without talking about theology, or at least about religion. Certainly not here and probably not anywhere else. Well, let me show you a concrete example, or let's go to the text, as we philologists like to say. Let me find. All right. I'm going to show you a scene from the first season. And in this scene, Doña Amelia, the Spanish noblewoman, is forced to watch reality TV. The ghosts have to watch whatever the living people have on the screen because they can't change the channel. Actually, she can, but she this time doesn't. And the person she's talking with actually is another ghost, Benjamin, who has just died. So he actually died in the fire. And so he's from our time. He's one of us, basically. And suddenly he finds himself in this place with a woman who's been dead for 500 years. And the argument that they have, or the discussion that they have, is about television. So I'm going to hope that this cue is in the right place, and if not, again, I counsel you to consult my handout. Let's hope that subtitles work.
Ovvjament semmejna kollox mistur bidu fi kwan.
And you'll see some living people wandering around. Of course, they can't see the ghosts. Only we can. So it makes us complicit with what they're doing.
Twanet. Għafru ta' sena kienu għamlu rezoluzzjoni biex ma jġildux.
We're not there yet. The producer gave me all the DVDs for the series, but they don't cue very cleanly. Go on with there.
U ma jkollżament kienu tiżammuha. Ma jidhirx li s-sitwazzjoni tħarbat kollox. Jerġgħu jibdew jagħtu.
Ija ma! Għallu jistadaw? Għaw u dikun ħaffewa?
Iva.
U daw ma taqawx ġifiri? Qatt. Mux kullu taw qabel il-moħbi għawek.
Le, ta' żgur li le, ġefem kienlek.
Ma nafx, ma għadajt jien. Ġgost fija li toqtar għal-persi ma li taqa maħuħ. Aħna l-inqas fi żminna kellna affarijiet ħafna aktar eċitanti x'naraw.
Bħal xiex.
Għattiba bel-qalbi. Intom ta' daw iż-żminijiet għandkom din ħaġa tax-xaw.
Television.
Fuq il-bit. U għanna fi żminna kellna pereżempju l-eżekuzzjonijiet pubbliċi.
Kif?
Fi, m'hemm xejn tisba' minn eżekuzzjoni pubblika fil-pjatta tal-Belt. Konna nistennaw bil-ħerqa. Naħar patetiċi. Nagħmlu kriminali. U l-adulteri. Naqtawlhom rathom barra.
U dik kienet xi ħaġa pjaċeva.
Naqbella, fi żmieni kienet il-ħarġa tal-familja.
Isfan.
Lija, kena minn ħajqtu għadda bit-tadam. Tex ma kontra għadda bomijiet, donna għamila dil-fotta katolja ġani Gomez. Lele. U għara kollox kien jiddu tant pjaċiri. Issa, jien minn xu għadda l-ħobb it-tfal. Taf ben. Pero, ma tistax toqt iġġaħħadhom id-divertiment tagħhom u xulteka.
Ija, ma minnu ma tistax tagħmilhom. Ħadd ma jkun fuq il-television.
X'ma jmut ħadd noqgħod nieħu minn festival, kull ma nara sparar u spluzzjonijiet u ġmija.
Ija, ma dak ikunu figuraċ ta'.
Kif figuraċ ta'?
Il-fizmina kien hemm teatru le?
Ukoll, ma kienx popolari daqs l-eżekuzzjonijiet pubbliċi.
Iva, mhux dak il-punt imma bħalma kien hemm atturi fid-teatru l-istess fuq television.
Ġifri xejn mu vera. Jaċtaq ikunu qegħdin.
Mela.
Mhux ħela saħi.
Well, I think this is a really nice example of making good use of a supernatural premise. So if you're a critic or a historian, you can achieve only partial understanding of the past. but Doña Amelia actually comes from the 16th century. So within the world created by the show, her account of this period is necessarily authoritative. So the question then is, what does the series do with that authority? And what I think it does here is it responds to a particular memory tradition, which is the one that regards the Crusader period as the one during which Malta affirmed its Christian character by defending Europe against Islam. But this scene instead describes the period in terms that come directly from the Enlightenment critique of religion. In fact, they come directly from Dom Mintoff's speeches against the church, as we saw back in the 1960s. So what her speech does is it translates those kinds of sentiments into comedy, which in one sense makes them less controversial, because after all, this is all invented. But in another sense, it makes them more powerful. In the fictional world of the series, ghosts from different periods all live together, right, in the same place. And this means that they can talk to each other directly. So when Amelia tells us that she loved watching all these public executions, she marks herself as belonging to the past, right? She identifies herself to us as a pre-modern person. But just in case that wasn't clear, we have then an actual modern person who stands in for us, for the Enlightenment, for modernity, expressing shock and horror at the things that she finds completely inoffensive. And so when the series brings these two figures together, it is a kind of implicit critique of one common narrative of Maltese Christian identity, as well as a script for a different kind of self-understanding. In other words, it makes Europeanness depend on embracing the Enlightenment rather than Crusader heroics. Air Malta didn't buy it. If you flew on Air Malta, note the safety video, the character in the safety video who's putting on the belt is a knight of Malta. It's a crusader. But they did kind of the same humor where he's kind of puzzled by all the different artifacts of modernity. Now I can't resist adding a kind of retroactive reading of this scene. So this scene was aired in 2011 before the emergence of the so-called Islamic State. And so for us now, when we hear about beheadings and burnings and all of this, it's hard not to think of Daesh, right? So if you read it backwards, the scene in effect says that the most nightmarish Islamic present is precisely the most glorious Christian past, right? So it's in a sense a vindication of the church, but also a criticism of it. Okay, I'm going to take another case, which is contemporary history, in effect, although it uses, again, ghostly characters to make its point. Back in 2010, when Deceluti began its run, the debate was already underway about the place of homosexuality in public life. And this is the debate that culminated in the passage of the Civil Unions Bill, which legalizes same-sex marriage. So, how did Deceluti intervene in this debate? So late in the first season, the ghosts discover that Ciccio, the Italian pilot, is gay. And it turns out that Manuel, the guy that looks like me, is a rabid homophobe and wants to expel him from the spirit world. And they have to do that because they're all trapped together. They can't go anywhere else. It's not like if they don't like each other, they can just go somewhere else. They have to live for eternity in this place. So Manuel initiates a procedure, a legal procedure in the ghost world that will expel Ciccio. So the ghosts hold an election, and this gave the writers a chance to make fun of reality TV. It was all very amusing. But in the scene I'm going to show you, what happens is, the computer is still working. Yes. Is the scene will start when The ghosts have finished voting. They voted Chicho out of the afterlife, and Mr. M, the mysterious Mr. M, is going to appear to carry out the sentence. So again, it'll take a few seconds to set up, and I thank you for your patience.
U allura hawnhekk id-deċiżjoni saret. Manuel torbok tilaqgħet lura. Ma' sħabek u jitlaq ċiċċo.
Manuel jibqa' u ċiċċo se jitlaq. È pronto tenente?
Ma ħadistom fil-infern.
Il-fern? Le.
Toqba ġabart, mux għall-infern.
Iva, hekk taħseb. Mela skontok Malta l-bokka tal-infern allura, toqba kull imkien.
Mela fejn qed titfa'?
Issa dik biċċa tiegħek. Tenente?
È stato un vero piacere. Għal-kost ħafna li sitt nafkom kollha. Manuel, mi mancherai, Manuel.
Tenente? Ġidu morru. Dopo di lei.
Understand. Ma rridx. Ma rridx titla' ċiċċo. Irrid nieħu kollox lura.
Kif? Issa?
Iva. Jien għamilt żball. Xi kultant jiena tubu ignorant. Ma rridux jitlaq.
Kemm issa li hemm Manuel?
Fil-każ Murina.
Sidin jibqa?
Naf li wara dak li ġara, probabbli ma tixtarani iktar bajnek. Ma wara dan iż-żmien kollu flimkien, ma rridx titlaq ħabba fija. Mistejja.
Kollok problemi, Manuel. Hm? Int trid tibqa'.
Bina jiffer jirrek fuq rasek. Meta tparla fil-vojt, Manuel, eh?
ħatibqa'
Għan jibqa'.
So again, from a sort of visual criticism standpoint, right, they're doing terrific work here with the premise. And again, you have to appreciate, they don't really have lots of Hollywood, technology, special effects, all of that, right? And they're doing really well, I think. So they make it literal. So in other words, they make homophobia literal. So it's not just a matter of opposing the referendum or whatever it might be. It's actually dropping your friend into a hole in the ground. And so even Manuel, when he is confronted with that kind of reality, which again, since we're dealing with the afterlife, this is actually even more real than real life, right? This is the moral order of the universe concretized in front of you. Even he has a realization about what his beliefs entail. Now this brings us to an interesting point about the Januti, which is that even though it's about the afterlife, it's not a particularly Christian world. The ghosts can be rewarded for good behavior, they can be punished for bad behavior, but there's no reference to God, there's no reference to Jesus, and there's no reference to the devil. Nor is it clear that the teachings of Christianity hold true in the world established by the story. And as I said, it turns out, in fact, that the person running the show is Il Boss, and Il Boss is a woman. So this is not what you get when you go to church in Malta on Sunday. Okay, this is some other supernatural order. Right? Now, I want to come back at the end to that problem. But first, I want to point out something else about the scenes that you saw. There's something they have in common, which is in both cases you have a foreigner speaking Maltese. So in her scene, Doña Amelia speaks not only a bit of Spanish, but she actually speaks Maltese with a Spanish accent. The actor, Kim Dudley, was a Comp Lit MA at the University of Malta, and she actually invented her own Spanish accent because there is only, as far as I know, one Spanish-speaking learner of Maltese in the world. And I met him a few months ago. So she just had to make it up. I mean, it's pure ideology. She just had to create an accent, which she did by, if you noticed, using a theta for all of the intervocalic S's. And in this case, as you saw, Ciccio speaks more or less half in Italian and half in Maltese, and he also, the actor Carl Skembry, invented his own accent, which involves pronouncing the Prof not as a glottal stop but as a K, based on the way Maltese used to be spelled when it was spelled as if it were Italian. So he went back, found that, and invented an accent, which again is not a real accent. No Italians try to learn Maltese as far as I know. And so he had to make up what it would sound like. So why this is interesting for me is that the Januti here is doing something very unusual, is it's representing Maltese history as plural and multilingual. Okay? So these people are part of Maltese history, but they're not native speakers of the language. Now there is one group that's not represented here. Which is, well, I interviewed the director and I asked her, or the writer, and I said, why did you not go back further? Why aren't there any Arabs? And he said, well, we thought about going back further in history, but he said that the further back you go, the harder it is to write characters. And I wish I had pressed him on that point, because I'd love to know more about why he thinks that. But one immediate problem is, what language would they speak? So in any event, the figure of the Muslim, whether an Arab or a Turk, doesn't appear here. Now, you might wonder why I would want there to appear an Arab or a Turk. The answer is simply that the figure of the Muslim is a recurrent element in local legend, folk poetry, school books, and popular novels. These figures are essentially narrative devices. They exist simply to be everything that the virtuous Christian characters are not. But in more recent times, of course, the Maltese have begun to encounter real Muslims, most notably in the form of refugees, asylees, immigrants from different countries. And of course, as we heard about today, this is a debate that continues to provoke a lot of ill feeling, not only between different parts of Maltese society, but also between Malta and other European countries. Now, I think another reason, though, is it's not simply that there aren't any Muslim characters, there aren't any Christian characters either. The series is able to achieve the effects it does because it doesn't commit itself to the moral order of the universe being conformable with Christianity or any other religion. And so the one thing that it cannot represent is any actually existing religious commitment. In fact, I asked Carlos, why isn't there, what would happen if you put a priest in there? He said, oh no, we couldn't do that. And I said, is that because the church would object? He said, no, it's not that. It's just that it wouldn't work. And I think here is a case where perhaps literary criticism can see something that the creator himself cannot, which is that in order for this to work, you essentially have to repress one element. And the element you have to repress is any particular existing religious commitment. So in other words, if you had a character who was specifically Muslim or specifically Christian, you'd have to make a choice, since you're showing the afterlife, about whether those religions are true or false or both, or neither. In other words, you'd have to engage explicitly with theology instead of engaging with it implicitly. So in this world then, the world of the spirit that we see here is ecumenical, pluralistic, the sort of place that a lot of people want Malta to become. Many of our speakers on immigration, it seems, feel that way. Now this brave new world doesn't require an abandonment of Christianity. That's never the implication. In fact, the scene that we just saw with Chicho and Manuel, I mean, that's a kind of embodiment of all of these Christian virtues of self-sacrifice and forgiveness. But it can't admit, this kind of utopian space cannot make room for any particular religion without fatally damaging its premises of representation. In that sense, it resembles Malta itself and perhaps metaphorically the European Union, whose commitment to pluralism and toleration ties itself in knots when called upon to accommodate communities that reject or are believed to have rejected those values. Now, again, though, I keep coming back to this notion of manifest and latent content. If you repress something somewhere, it has to appear again somewhere else, at least if you're a classic Freudian, or maybe a Lacanian. I don't think you can really sweep all this under the rug and have it disappear. I think that it appears somewhere, and I'll tell you where I think it appears. But I have to admit that it's funny. I work on obsolescence, okay? I work in the 9th century. I don't deal with living people. And it was very funny to meet the actors and to meet the crew and the cast because they have their own ideas about what they were doing. So I'll tell you what I think, my theory about the repression, and then what Carlos told me. My theory was that, take Mr. M. His name is never explained. He is the messenger between the boss and the ghosts. So if you're the messenger of the gods, then you're Mercury.
The Maltese were able to play this role of mediator because it was easy. The Maltese are talented in language, and I think even now, this is a bit of a struggle, and I think this is part of what you were saying, but I understood it well, that from one side, the Maltese language is a kind of, if we take the German word Alleinstellungsmerkmal, which is
Unique selling point.
unique selling point. And from the other side, of course, one feels now secure within the whole community of the European Union, and with all what's happening in North Africa and in the Middle East, of course, this is understandable that one wants to keep to the secure side. So this was the comment. To the question. From your experience and from your research, do you think that dealing with history and historicizing, that there is a tendency towards realism or towards having the history one would like to have?
It's a great question. One of the reasons that I like studying popular culture is that you don't go into it with the expectation that you're going to find real history. What you're going to find is ideology, right? And so you're free to study what very creative people think their audiences will be able to understand about the past. And then when they're especially talented people, creative people, like the ones who did the Djibouti, they don't only want to give them what they want, but they also want to challenge them a little bit. And so I think I began this research by not looking for, in other words, it doesn't concern me at all whether the knights really did, all those awful things that she said. That's not the point, right? The point is more that she's challenging this notion of the crusader as hero. So the question of what the crusaders really were is a question, fortunately, that I don't have to engage with. Right? So I guess I take a pass on that one. That's a brilliant question. Thank you.
Further comments? Yeah, Maria, bitte.
Thank you very much for your illustrating lecture. I was wondering, I totally agree with you that popular culture is somehow a medium for the discourse, or what you have called to explain the moral order of the universe. But do you think this is only valid for more secular societies? Because I would say that this is also true for more religious-oriented societies, like in the Arab world. I mean, I would not make this distinction.
Are you talking about like the religious shows, like the Musalsalat, the Ramadan series, where they...
For example, yeah.
But
But there is a lot of comedy also. I mean, the movies in the Egyptian cinema that also have this moral order.
You're absolutely right. I guess maybe it's almost impossible to imagine a popular culture product that isn't a morality play, right?
Mm-hmm.
I guess I focused only on this because it was specifically about the past, where it involves characters from the past. And so it was not simply morality as one should conceive it, but it was how to think about the past. And that's why I chose it. I've worked a little bit on the Musalsalat also in Iran and in the Arab countries, but then again I also just chose the historical ones. For some reason I'm never interested in shows that are about the world that we live in. And so, when they did the one on Amin al-Ma'mun and Hamid al-Rashid and all of, I just love that stuff. And I had a brilliant student at Middlebury, actually, a language school in the United States, who wrote I wanted to teach the students about the Abbasids. She said in her paper that the show, even though it was set in the 9th century, was actually sending a message to young people about what the limits are of how young men and women should behave together. It's something I didn't see at all, So I think it's absolutely there. But I guess I have a very limited kind of philological approach to these things.
Yeah, I'm curious about reactions to this show, or were you not interested in that? Just in the production and what was behind it. So was there actually a kind of proper discourse or public debates afterwards? You know, some people hating it and others loving it and so on and so forth? Or?
It's a very good question. There isn't really any industry of popular cultural criticism here.
Mm-hmm.
So when I looked in the press, what I found were articles about the actors, what they do on weekends and things like that, and promotional materials and all that. I did not find a single Maltese critical discussion of this at all. I did ask the producers and the cast about reactions to it, expecting that the church would have condemned them, and they said absolutely nothing like that at all. And I'm not sure why that is. I also followed discussions on Facebook, because after every episode there would be a lot of discussion. And you would occasionally have people expressing discomfort about how it challenged the church, or how it challenged the teachings of the Catholic Church. I guess I should, spoiler alert, at the end you find out that the moral order actually depends on reincarnation. And when that happened, Facebook kind of, I wouldn't say exploded, but I would say a number of people wrote and said, well, this contradicts the doctrine of the resurrection, so, this is a bad thing. So maybe, one easy answer is to say that precisely because it was uncomfortable, people enjoyed it. It was very popular, extremely popular. And it may be that this kind of, what we would think of, or what I expected to see as objection, ended up being part of the enjoyment. People felt that they were coming very close to an edge, but not crossing it. That's one of the things that comedy does, right? It lets you get very close and not cross. And I think maybe the discomfort and the awkwardness of some of it is why people enjoyed it and kept coming back and watching it.
But church is one, if I may just add this, church is one thing in religion, but does it tell us more about the national understanding of nationalism, nation, to be what it means to be Maltese and Maltese history? Because there are of course a lot of shows that you could compare to this. I can't remember the name of this Turkish show where they portrayed the sultans in a more or less authentic way, which wouldn't fit with the official notion of them of being, not having a harem and things like that. So here, if you have, of course, ghosts talking to each other from different epochs, what does it actually tell about the notion of being Maltese? Is there a conflict? Is there more conflict, or is it more harmony and happiness to be where people are now, or is it kind of discomfort that it might have been different? Yeah. How's that? Or is it just good fun and entertainment?
Well, if I thought it was just good fun, I guess I'd be out of a job. Because, right, if it's successful, interesting, popular good fun, then there's something else happening. I think that the overt message, the intended message, was one of harmony, right? I think it was purposeful that they embraced the gay character, that they embraced foreigners. I think that was purposeful. Now, whether this has any effect on behavior is a question for sociologists. It was argued that the approval of same-sex marriage in the United States, which required it to be approved in many states and then by the Supreme Court, was a very long process. The way that happened was largely because of television, that there were so many shows, not only sympathetic gay characters, but just normal gay characters, that eventually even people in places where you never expect just got used to it. Now that's a question for sociologists, so I couldn't tell you. That scene that you saw was 2 years before the Civil Unions Bill, and it was the most popular show in the country. So, did it change people's attitudes? That's really a sociological question, I don't know, but it seems to me that it's not coincidental. And we can go into the level of biography. The producer told me that she wanted to do that because her son is gay. So I said, did you really want to get that message out? And she said, well, I didn't think of it that way, but maybe. So, yeah.
We have 3 more questions, and after them I would close the list of questions. So it is Sarhan, and then Pierre, and then the gentleman over there.
Thank you for your presentation. Can you say a few words about the debate about the notion of nation? What means the notion nation in Maltese context?
Well, I've read, linguists and sociologists have done surveys where they ask people, how do you define it? And many people say it's speaking Maltese. Many people say it's being Christian, being Catholic, and being part of the church. Obviously, right, there isn't an answer. There's sort of a vague combination of history and religion and language. And I think the show deals with all of that directly. There's a very funny scene I didn't show you where 2 of the characters, one represents the vulgar working class